All right, peace and blessings, everybody. It is Sunday, March the 18th, the year 2018. I want to say this at the beginning of every video. I wish you guys had a professional reader to listen to, but we don't have that. You have me, and you're stuck with me. If you want to read it yourself, the same PDF file that I'm reading from is on Year of Jubilee on the Hinkson webpage. It's called A Cesspool of Judicial Corruption. I'm going to start at the top of page 101. My goal is to make it to page 150. This is a 300 and something page book, so we have a long way to go. Page 101. Affiant Janet Olson is making this affidavit on affiant's own free will and in a timely manner and in good faith. Acne Pro Tune for the reason that to delay would repudiate affiant's good cause. Facts. Affiant, to the best of her knowledge, information, and belief, states the following. 1. On or about October the 17th, 2003, affiant and her husband, hereinafter husband, entered into a business agreement with Gunderson, wherein Gunderson agreed to provide certain services during an interim business development phase. One of the services Gunderson was to provide was a dwelling space for affiant and husband. During this interim time, affiant and husband stayed with Gunderson for about 17.6 weeks. At the end of that time, Gunderson breached the agreement and affiant and husband departed. The nature of the agreement is confidential. However, an interim part of the agreement was that affiant would, in the meantime, voluntarily provide administrative and secretarial services specifically regarding Gunderson's verbal and written attacks on corruption of the U.S. government and their agencies. 2. On or about November the 20th, 2003, affiant was eating breakfast on a TV tray in the living room of Gunderson's condo in Las Vegas, watching television with Gunderson's roommate, a semi-invalid woman named Anna Mae Newman, hereinafter May. When Gunderson's telephone rang, as is the custom at the Gunderson's household, May answered the telephone for Gunderson. May picked up the cordless phone receiver that had been placed especially on a fold-out secretary beside the chair, where May normally then said the name of the caller out loud, Nancy. Gunderson picked up his receiver located on his desk in his work area, located where the dining room would normally be located. The dining room is a 3 solid walled nook that opens into a living room area, and it serves as Gunderson's primary work area in the condo. Gunderson began immediately talking to Nancy. Affiant inadvertently overheard the Gunderson side of a telephone conversation between Nancy and Gunderson. A. After a few moments had passed, affiant heard Gunderson tell the caller, "Please excuse me, I thought you were another Nancy, but you're a Nancy I haven't heard from in years." B. Gunderson spoke to this Nancy for about 5 minutes. After Gunderson hung up the telephone, he was annoyed and upset at what happened, and he scolded May for not telling him Nancy's last name, and in the strongest possible way chastised her, and then told her that in the future to give him the first and the last name of each caller. He further explained to May that he was waiting a very important telephone call from Nancy Cook, and stated that he had been embarrassed when he discovered that he had told this other Nancy confidential things that he was supposed to tell only to Nancy Cook. 3. On or about November the 22nd, 2003, affiant's husband and May were seated in the living room watching TV while Gunderson was working at his desk. The telephone rang and May answered. She carefully called out the name Nancy Cook, and affiant could hear in her voice the fact that she was proud of her achievement in giving both first and last names of the caller to Gunderson. Affiant did not pay attention to this conversation, since she did not know who Nancy Cook was, and the conversation did not seem to be relevant to any work affiant was currently doing for Gunderson. 4. On or about November the 23rd, 2003, affiant was working in Gunderson's back office at affiant's computer. This office is a converted bedroom located down a 15-foot corridor leading away from the combined living dining room. A. Affiant heard May laboriously walking with her walking cane down the hallway, and then affiant stepped into the corridor in order to see what was going on. B. When May saw affiant, May handed affiant the cordless telephone she was carrying and breathlessly asked Affiant to see that Gunderson took the call immediately as Gunderson was in the bathroom. May explained that the call was from Nancy Cook and that Gunderson was waiting for it. C. Affiant took the cordless receiver and knocked on the bathroom door and then called out to Gunderson, "Nancy Cook is on the phone." D. Gunderson immediately came out of the bathroom and grabbed the telephone receiver from Affiant and returned to his work area in the dining room. E. Affiant was intrigued at this event because Affiant was acting as Gunderson's administrative assistant. And as such, Affiant felt it her duty to know who Gunderson's important callers were so she could keep track of the things Gunderson was working on, and thereby help Gunderson in a more efficient manner to get caught up on his 6-week backlog of correspondence, calls, and projects, as well as to help Gunderson establish a sound office operation in the future. Affiant now recognized that in some way Nancy Cook was relevant to Gunderson's work, and as a result of this realization, Affiant began to pay attention to anything related to Nancy Cook. In furtherance of Affiant's goal to assist Gunderson, Affiant paid attention to the conversation as May completed typing letters for Gunderson in the back office and listened attentively for the next 15 or 20 minutes as Gunderson spoke to Nancy Cook. "What do you do when someone spills your milk all over the floor? Better get a mop." Chapter 19, The Plot Thickens. The office door was wide open and Affiant could clearly hear Gunderson speaking to Nancy Cook. Affiant heard the approximate statements listed below made by Gunderson in the course of this phone call. 1. So you're saying he has to come in, but he has a problem with that. 2. I know, I understand, but he obviously does not understand how things work. 3. I'll have to explain to him that his effort will be unsupported and will not be considered evidence without his cooperation. 4. What will be needed? Pause. I mean, what exactly are they going to need him to verify? 5. Gunderson then apparently wrote down on a yellow legal pad the information given to Hint by Nancy Cook. See item 5. 6. Shortly thereafter, the conversation ended. 5. Later that same day, Affiant was placing several letters on Gunderson's desk in the dining room alcove for his signature, and Affiant saw numerous phrases written in Gunderson's handwriting on a yellow legal pad on Gunderson's desk. A. At the top of the page was written the names J.C. Harding on the left side of the page and Nancy Cook on the right side of the page. Below these names was a list of statements. 1. Keep it simple. 2. Don't be elaborate. The word elaborate was misspelled. 3. Be consistent. 4. Be confident. 5. Corroborate every statement. The word corroborate was misspelled. 6. Affiant later became aware that there were other items written on the page behind this front page, but Affiant did not see the items. Affiant is aware of further written material on the second and third pages. Because at the time Gunderson was speaking to J.C. Harding about his interview testimony, Gunderson used the legal pad and turned several pages as he read the items to Harding. See items 10, 11C. Affiant noticed that the name Nancy Cook was written on a yellow post-it, placed by the telephone handset on the desk, and below the name was written a telephone number with the 208 area code. Affiant was familiar with this area code and knew that it was an Idaho area code. The post-it drew Affiant's attention because Gunderson was not in the habit of writing telephone numbers on post-its. Normally, Gunderson wrote telephone numbers on a yellow legal pad or in his personal telephone directory. On or about the morning of November the 25th, 2003, Affiant and husband were preparing breakfast in the kitchen when the telephone rang and May answered it. May called out Nancy Cook's name so Gunderson could hear it, and he quickly picked up the telephone handset on his desk. Affiant inadvertently overheard the Gunderson side of the telephone conversation between Nancy Cook and Gunderson. A. Gunderson made a statement, the gist of which is, "I've had no luck with him. He is afraid of repercussions." B. After a few minutes, Gunderson said, "Keep trying." C. "Don't worry, we'll get him." D. By the time the conversation ended, May was seated in the living room eating her breakfast. Gunderson hung up the telephone and asked Affiant, "Do you know Nancy Cook?" Affiant stated that she did not and wondered at the motivation behind the question, since it originated out of the blue without any foundation. 7. On or about December the 1st, 2003, Affiant inadvertently overheard the Gunderson side of a telephone conversation between Gunderson and someone called J.C. Affiant was sitting in the living room with husband along with May watching TV. Throughout this conversation, Gunderson repeatedly said the initials JC to identify the caller on the other end of the phone. During much of the conversation, Gunderson deliberately turned his chair away from the living room area in an attempt to muffle his voice so as to prevent the people sitting in the living room from hearing the content of his conversation. Gunderson kept looking over his shoulder to see if Affiant or husband were listening. His mannerisms were like those of someone who is attempting to engage in a covert conversation. Example, he spoke quietly, he turned away from the location where people were sitting, and he looked over his shoulder repeatedly. Nevertheless, Affiant overheard some of the conversation and made a note of it because the content of this call revealed that Gunderson was urging someone to cooperate with the FBI. Gunderson's standard advice is to discourage all this practice. During this telephone call, Gunderson made many comments and suggestions which are stated below, not necessarily in the same order as delivered over the phone. A. JC, it is my considered opinion you need to cooperate with the FBI all you can. I can help you with that. B. He won't know that it was you. C. They protect those who assist them. D. You may not have to do anything more. E. Listen, the truth is the truth. What do you have to be afraid of? F. Sometime during this conversation, Affiant went into the back office to work, and Gunderson came to the back office door and stated because he was going to be smoking his cigar and that his closing of the door was so that the smoke would not irritate Affiant. 8. On or about December the 2nd or 8th, 2003, Affiant inadvertently overheard another telephone conversation between Gunderson and JC. While Affiant was working in Gunderson's back office with the door wide open, since Affiant was working in the office earlier in this morning than was usual, Affiant does not believe that Gunderson knew that Affiant was in the back office working. Affiant's usual practice was not to begin working until a little later in the day, around noon. This conversation took place around 9:10 a.m. Gunderson made comments and suggestions to JC listed below. A. I was in the FBI for 27 years, so I know how they operate. B. We've been through this before, but I'll answer any concerns you may have. C. Affiant's attention became focused on her work, but then she heard Gunderson speak for a few minutes on the subject of Mike Reconusciotto, who is currently in a federal prison in Massachusetts. Affiant became very interested and her attention shifted to the phone call. 1. Gunderson specifically told JC how Reconusciotto, I can't do it, and he had assisted the FBI in the capture of a known hitman in Indio, California, and how the FBI had protected this hitman, John P. Nichols, an FBI informant, who went to prison for only 2 or 3 years. Affiant immediately noticed the discrepancy in the story that Gunderson usually tells to anyone who will listen. Gunderson usually tells the story of how the FBI attempted to thwart Reconusciotto's and Gunderson's capture of this murder-for-hire assassin. And in fact, Gunderson usually states that the FBI inappropriately protects their informants, as in the case of Nichols, who should have been sent to prison for 25 or more years for the murder of 2 people, but instead only went to prison for 2 counts of solicitation for murder. She said that the Indio Police Department went undercover by having a deputy wear a body mic to record the offer to hire Nichols for a hit. 3. Gunderson also stated to JC that Gunderson and Reconusciotto were responsible for assisting the FBI in protecting their own in 1988 when a black ops plan went awry. Those individuals received reduced sentences like Nichols. Again, the discrepancy in this story is that Gunderson usually states that he and Reconusciotto thwarted the FBI by bringing down several of the FBI's hitmen in 1988. 4. Gunderson said the body mic was the only way to go. It's damaging enough to be useful, and all we need now is for you to finish your part. 5. Gunderson then stated, I'm only giving you an example of the extent that the boys will go when protecting their own. You have nothing to worry about. 6. All you need to do is your civic duty, and then they'll do the rest. 7. You agreed to do this. You can't back out on us now. 8. Gunderson then received another telephone call on the call waiting service and told JC that he had to take the call and asked JC to call him tomorrow, stating that he would give JC some tips for when you go in. 9. On or about December the 4th, 2003, Affiant again inadvertently overheard another telephone conversation between Gunderson and JC. At this time, Affiant was in the kitchen making lunch. May was sick and stayed in her bedroom that day and consequently was unavailable to answer the telephone for Gunderson, as is the usual custom. Affiant had gone into the living room to retrieve her water-drinking glass when the telephone rang. Affiant answered the phone and asked for the caller's name, whereupon he replied, J.C. Harding. J.C. then asked, "How are you doing, May?" Affidavit did not answer this question. Affiant called out to Gunderson, who was sitting a few feet away at his desk. "It's J.C. Harding," and she waited until Gunderson picked up the telephone handset on his desk. Then Affiant left the living room and returned to the kitchen where the phone conversation could be heard very clearly while Affiant was getting herself a glass of water and proceeded to finish making lunch for herself and husband. Gunderson made comments and suggestions to J.C. listed below. A. Well, J.C., it's up to you, but you need to do the right thing. B. If you don't see it through, they may wonder about you and why you agreed to do the body mic in the first place. C. The recording is not valid unless it is verified in a statement to the FBI. Pause. That's what she said. D. He's not going to find out about the body mic or who made the recording. Pause. Even if he did find out, he won't be able to do anything about it. E. Do you believe in this country or don't you? F. Now, if you believe in this country, then you believe that we're the good guys, and we're just trying to keep the country from going to the dogs. My buddies are good guys like me, not like some of the others that you hear me talk about from time to time. He obviously thinks that being a freedom fighter gives him the authority to trample on the laws of Idaho and of this country. Without any regard for the repercussions, Affiant believes that Gunderson was referring to David Hinkson. G. I promise that they'll keep you out of it, but your statement has to be secured. H. Don't worry about it. I'm doing what I can to make sure the judge doesn't bring you in. I know people. I'll take care of it. J. Gunderson received a telephone call from his daughter, Lori, on his call waiting service and asked J.C. to call him back later. 10. A little later that same day, December the 4th, 2003, Affiant completed a document that needed Gunderson's review and brought it from the back office to Gunderson, who was seated at his desk in the dining room work area. As she handed Gunderson the document, Affiant saw that Gunderson was holding a yellow legal pad, studying what was written in it. When Gunderson saw Affiant approaching him, he quickly flipped 2 pages forward and placed the yellow legal pad face down on his desk. This was very unusual behavior on the part of Gunderson. Affiant believes this yellow pad was the same yellow pad on which Gunderson had taken notes and written the advice that he had received from Nancy Cook in their phone conversation of November the 23rd, 2003. Gunderson was in the habit of using only one legal pad at a time, and this was the only legal pad in use at this time. 11. Approximately 3 hours later on that same day, December the 4th, 2003, Affiant was still alone in the kitchen making dinner. May was still bedridden. The telephone rang, and since Gunderson was in the bathroom, Affiant answered the telephone. Again, the caller identified himself as J.C. Harding and asked to speak to Gunderson. At this moment, Gunderson exited the bathroom and asked who was on the phone, and Affiant said it was J.C., and then waited for Gunderson to pick up the phone handset at his desk in the dining room. Affiant then hung up the telephone in the living room and returned to the kitchen. The gist of this conversation was a script that Gunderson was giving to J.C. Harding. Seemingly regarding the impending interview Gunderson was urging Harding to undergo with the FBI. The script was like a TV or movie script, supplying J.C. with specifics as to what to say to each question he would be asked. The script acted as a coaching session on what Harding was to say when giving information to the FBI. A. Affiant does not remember the exact wording of the entire script, but overheard Gunderson speak or make statements like, or similar to, you would say it naturally. For example, he seemed to need to confide in someone, and I just happened to be there. He said he didn't trust anyone and would have to take care of the matter himself. Use your own words. Affiant did not specifically hear any of the other phrases used as the script, but could ascertain from the nature of the phrases and advice given by Gunderson, and he was giving J.C. a script to follow similar to the type of script or coaching that attorneys give their clients before the client takes the witness stand. Affiant believes those phrases to be used for the script were written on the second and third pages of Gunderson's legal pad. Those pages Affiant had not seen but had observed Gunderson studying. B. Gunderson then said, I have it on good authority straight from the DA's office that after you make this statement, your involvement will be over. C. All you have to do is verify each statement was made by Dave and you on the body mic. D. Don't offer any more information than what is applicable to the tape. E. Let's do a rundown of your interview. After they ask you for your personnel information, they'll ask you the date of this conversation occurred, you tell them. Then they'll ask you the time it happened, and you tell them. Then they'll ask you why you brought up the subject to Dave, and you tell them it was from a previous conversation and that you were instructed to get it recorded using a body mic. F. They'll ask you who instructed you, and you tell them. Keep it simple. Affiant walked out of the kitchen and stood in front of Gunderson's desk because Gunderson was coughing. Affiant was in the habit of filling Gunderson's water glass when it was empty, as it was at that time. Gunderson was startled when he looked up and saw Affiant standing there. Affiant pointed silently to Gunderson's empty glass, and Gunderson handed the empty glass to her. Affiant then took it to the kitchen to refill it with water while the conversation continued. They'll ask you what Dave said and what you replied. So you have to learn that tape. Be specific but don't elaborate. And be consistent. They have to verify everything that's on the tape. It's as simple as that. H. Gunderson's chair squeaked and Affiant leaned slightly out of the kitchen doorway so that she was able to see Gunderson at his desk. Affiant noticed that Gunderson was reading from the yellow legal pad where his handwritten notes were, and that Gunderson was turning several pages as he read out loud to JC all that was written on the pad. Gunderson was turned away from Affiant, so the specific words he used in this script were unintelligible. I. Gunderson then turned back around and laid the legal pad down on his desk and then said, when you're answering each question they ask, you must be confident. Don't show any uncertainty. J. Affiant returned to Gunderson's desk and handed him his glass, now filled with water. He took it from her and mouthed the words, thank you, and drank deeply from the glass and set it aside. Affiant returned to the kitchen. K. Don't tell them that you talked to me, emphasis added. 1. Anything that's unclear will become clear after your statement. I know you'll do a good job. M. Dave's arrogant and thinks he can get away with Dave's arrogant and thinks he can get by with murder. N. Yes, we were friends, but that's another story. I don't want to go into that. You concentrate on your duty and we'll put Dave where he belongs. He and everyone else like him who are trying to destroy the fabric of this great country, one by one. O. Remember, don't tell them that you talked to me. P. It's just better if it comes from you and no one else. Q. Gunderson quickly ended the conversation by reassuring the caller. You know what you have to do, and I feel sure you will do the right thing. He then hung up. Affiant walked over to Gunderson's desk and then he looked up at her inquiringly. She asked, how is Dave Hinkson doing? Gunderson replied, oh, that wasn't about Dave Hinkson, that's about Dave Pisnell. Note, Affiant was familiar with Dave Pisnell's case, which involved real estate that Pisnell purchased in the desert and the U.S. government had confiscated, and Affiant knew that Gunderson and Dave Pisnell were still friends, so Affiant realized that Gunderson's statement was not untrue. Affiant also knew that Gunderson was not working with the DA's office in the Pisnell case. Another fact that Pisnell's case is that it's located in California, not Idaho. The only other Dave that Affiant was aware of who was located in Idaho and who was associated with Gunderson was David Hinkson. These statements above did not correspond with the Pisnell case. As a result, Affiant stored this conversation away for future reference and placed a mental red flag on it. And at the time of Affiant's question to Gunderson, Affiant said nothing and returned to the kitchen to complete the preparation of dinner. Following the above statements of fact, Jeanette Olson presented her opinion. Her affidavit continued. Based upon knowledge, information, and belief, Affiant estimates that the time spent by Gunderson on the various conversations with J.C. Harding referred to herein equaled approximately 8 hours total. Affiant is aware that Gunderson spends this amount of time only in unusual cases of urgency or importance. Affiant also believes that Affiant did not hear every conversation between Gunderson and J.C. Harding. Based upon knowledge, information, and belief, Affiant states, these conversations inadvertently overheard in the course of Affiant's duties as Gunderson's assistant are the overt acts necessary for conviction, showing that Gunderson, with the assistance of Nancy Cook and J.C. Harding, did, in fact, plan, fabricate, and implement a false and fraudulent scheme or artifice to defraud David Hinkson of his constitutional due process rights. This was done so that the perpetrators could wrongfully convict him of crimes he did not commit. Affiant believes that Nancy Cook was using vindictive prosecution as the method to effectuate the enterprise's goal and may be the architect for this scheme or artifice. Gunderson, Cook, and Harding, acting in concert, established the conspiracy agreement in which their objective as to obstruct justice, suborn perjured testimony, manufacture evidence, commit fraud, and the intent to defraud, commit fraud on the court, and misprision of a felony by their silence, using wire fraud as essential elements of this criminal enterprise to falsely convict David Hinkson. Due to Affiant's clear observation as a witness of these crimes, Affiant believes that Ted Gunderson, Nancy Cook, and J.C. Harding, by their acts and actions, did in fact form a criminal enterprise in order to fulfill their objective to vindictively prosecute David Hinkson for crimes that he did not commit. Two reasons can explain these acts by the perpetrators. They are: 1. To have David Hinkson drop his civil lawsuit against Cook and others for their long train of wrongful acts and actions against him. And 2. There exists a possibility of great financial enrichment for each of the participants when they achieve their goal of convicting Hinkson and dividing up his assets. Affiant believes that as a direct and proximate result of the perpetrators' unlawful acts and actions, David Hinkson is now incarcerated, awaiting trial on trumped-up charges that he did not commit. Which part of the plan worked and for how long? But the landscape is changing. Chapter 20. Implementation of the Gunderson Plan. The Gunderson Plan apparently was for Hilder's girlfriend, Annie Bates, and J.C. Harding to go meet with David, set him up as someone who was actively soliciting people to murder 3 federal officers in a murder-for-hire scheme. David drew large audiences and held people somewhat spellbound. Water Oz sales skyrocketed every time he lectured. So it's no surprise that he couldn't recall having ever seen or met James Harding while at the Granada Forum in Los Angeles. When Annie Bates first approached him in December 2002, Annie told David she had skills and that she wanted to move to Idaho to work at Water Oz. She and J.C. Harding showed up at Water Oz the first week of January. David put them up. They spent the night and left the next morning. Annie came back to Grangeville on a bus claiming that she needed to earn some money and wanted to work part-time. Jerry Gray hired her. David agreed. Peter Zauringer, David's former brother-in-law and employee who held a degree in computer science, said Annie Bates was a computer genius. David loaned Annie a car. She announced to everyone that she was moving to Grangeville to take a job at Water Oz, where she intended to spend the rest of her life. Later, she claimed she moved her belongings to Boise and placed them in a Republic storage 12 by 20 unit, big enough for an automobile. After she was hired by Jerry, who was a direct link to Ted Gunderson, and Annie refused to associate with other female employees, especially during lunchtime. The company computer server and David's private computers were located in the basement of his house, adjacent to the factory. David allowed her to enter into his house and into his computers to do Water Oz work. Harding came to Idaho shortly after Annie was hired, also in January 2003, alleging he was just passing through on his way to Coureur d'Alene. It's a French word, it looks like. Harding arrived on David's doorstep late one afternoon in January 2003 in a 1923 Bugatti, vintage open car, without a top, doors, side windows, or a heater in the middle of winter. He had Ann Bates at his side. Both he and Annie were covered with frost from driving without a top. Harding was dressed in a World War I hood and goggles, complete with Red Baron type scarf, with frost on the stubbles of his whiskers. He ran around Grangeville, evidently trying to establish an identity as J.C. Steele. He did get newspaper coverage in Grangeville. One of the small town papers photographed them in the car and wrote a short story about how he was going to set up a radio station in the Grangeville area. His cover story was that he was a radio talk show host, that he had this in common with David. He said that on the air people knew him as J.C. Steele. Anthony Hilder claims Harding had his own radio talk show and used the name J.C. Steele as his radio name, but we failed to find any evidence that he ever hosted a radio show under the title J.C. Steele or otherwise. Possibly he may have called into a talk show. Ann Bates' grandfather ran a talk radio show in Sandusky, Ohio. Harding may have learned something about radio talk shows from Annie. Regardless, he established his presence in Grangeville so that no one could deny that he was there. He had made sure people noticed him. Since Annie Bates had no money or place to live when she first came to Wateroz, David allowed her to camp in his basement apartment, where the computers were located, until she could set up in her own place. Wateroz, 30 computers, all networked to the master server located in his basement. However, during the 2-week period she lived in David's home, she was clandestinely at night and over the noon hour on his computer when David was not aware. Greg Towerton, who later became the general manager of Wateroz, could see that she was constantly, like in the middle of the night, on David's computer hacking into something. We believe that she installed a keystroke software in his personal computer and that she stole information that was later used against David, such as copies of David's emails, which FDA agent Blenkinsop later used. He claimed he obtained all his information from factory computers. Although nothing on David's computer was incriminating, yet all his documents and attacks on the federal government were there. They had enough personal information that hackers could twist and use in any way that a twisted mind could conceive. Joanne Hogger, an employee whose husband was the Grangeville jailer, felt that David must be somewhat smitten with Annie Bates, because he would say things like, "That poor girl's in trouble and she really needs my help." Harding, using the name J.C. Steele, came into the office one day in the late January or early February 2003, was confronted by Joanne Hogger, who asked J.C., "What are you doing here?" Harding replied, "I've come to get rid of David and take over this place." On another occasion, Kathy, another Wateroz employee, asked J.C., "Oh, are you new here?" Harding replied, "I'm a friend of David." J.C. regularly was in phone contact with Annie. Phone records of all calls made from Annie Bates from David's downstairs bedroom showed that Annie called J.C. constantly. Her FBI 302 statement confirmed this. Had she any fear of David wanting to get romantically involved with her, she could have suggested that Harding move into David's basement apartment to protect her or find other lodging, unless the scenario was part of a plan to spend time in David's basement accessing his computers. David thought that she and J.C. had a relationship. It wasn't long before they moved into an apartment in Grangeville. They had gotten all they had needed. Another employee who prefers that I don't mention her name told me that she knew Annie Bates well, that she went to bars with Annie. Annie claimed she did not drink and didn't go out with other guys because she was J.C. Harding's girlfriend. Yet, although Annie contended she didn't drink, witnesses avowed that she was out drinking till 2 a.m. and drunk. She borrowed David's car regularly to go to Boise or Lewiston. We now believe that she was meeting with her handler, Hilder, and turning over hacked into information. Later we learned that the feds paid over $1,000 to JC in payment and gave him a late model Isuzu Trooper for trying to entrap David. The Trooper was purchased in Iowa in the name of Anthony Hilder and J.C. Harding, but not registered until March 2003, when Harding used the Wateroz address to register the vehicle in Idaho. The feds were confident that David had millions stashed worldwide, so this type of expenditure was merely a good investment. Although David had no personal interest in J.C., no one seems to know where he went, but witnesses reported that he returned to Grangeville area later on several occasions. Annie and J.C. rented an apartment in Grangeville in February. Annie said she didn't need to put Harding on the lease because he wasn't going to live there. J.C. brought Anthony Hilder twice to visit David. David talked about what happened when Hilder came. In the middle of March, Hilder showed up with J.C. Harding. Hilder still claimed that he was moving to Idaho and had a trailer behind his truck. He wanted to park this trailer inside our factory, and Jerry Gray told him he could not. Later, he parked his trailer at Matthew's house, where David's son was living, in Grangeville in the garage. While he was there were 4 other people at this meeting in my home, in my kitchen. He said that he wanted to make a video about my case. I told him about the rumors and about the lies that Cook had orchestrated to present in front of the grand jury. At this meeting, Harding was present, Jerry Gray, Rich Bellin, Charlie Phillips. He wanted $10,000 cash to make a documentary film for me called Prosecutorial Misconduct. He offered me a sample of his work. It was a video of him accusing the federal government of bombing the Twin Towers. I declined his offer and told him that I did not want to make a video because my case was not a big enough story to warrant such a video. I also told him that I didn't have $10,000 to my name anyway. At this point, Hilder got very angry. I think that if I had paid him the $10,000, he and Harding were there to accuse me of hiring them to be a hitman. Sorry, I lost my place. I am sure of this. Hilder was working with Gunderson and Agent Long to set me up. He was mad because he did not get the money. I had witnesses at this meeting. He was escorted off the property by Rich Bellin after he got angry, and he would not take no for an answer. Harding came back a week later with the FBI body wire to try to set me up again and failed when I was not even paying attention to what he was saying. It is interesting to note that all of these different people who seem to come up with the same $10,000 offers, where do they get this figure from? Is it just a coincidence? Shortly after, Bates showed up in a nearly new Isuzu pickup truck. She got her last check and left. I asked her where she got this lovely truck. She said she paid $400 for it from a college student in Moscow yesterday. The truck looked like it had a value of $9,000 to me. Later, I checked my phone records in the factory and noticed that she was calling the DMV the first few days after she had arrived. Hilder admitted that all the people he talked to in the Grangeville area said Dave never wanted to hire any hitman, but JC said that a couple Mexicans came to him in confidence and said, "Dave, we are going to have somebody killed." Hilder suggested that JC call Ted Gunderson. No mention was ever made of the Mexicans. However, thereafter, FBI agent Long comes on the scene. J.C. Harding testified that he had a conversation with David while in the presence of Patrick Johnson, a local 62-year-old man who did body and fender work. Patrick says he remembers a guy being present at a conversation he was having with David about a Ford Mustang that he had finished painting for David and was returning to him for inspection. Harding said that during that conversation in front of Patrick, David offered him money to kill 3 feds. Do you know who's on the phone? Hold on, just a second. Who is it? Do you know who it was? What state?
812, it doesn't say.
All right, well, I was expecting a phone call, but Harding said that during the conversation in front of Patrick, David offered him money to kill 3 feds. Patrick remembers that they talked about miscellaneous things and knows that David did not ask Harding to kill federal officials or anyone. Patrick said that they didn't discuss any such thing, that Harding is just lying. This was probably the same day that JC loaded $1,200 of product into his Isuzu Rodeo, March 17th or 18th, 2003, for which he never paid David. Agent Long alleged that Johnson was a militia member, but Patrick denies being associated with any such organizations. He said, though, that he often carries his handgun on his hip, mainly for protection from wolves and mountain lions, which are plentiful in the area where he lives. Now, what happens with the full weight of the victim? Let me read this again. I'm so sorry. Now, what happens with the full weight of the government descends upon a lonely victim. Chapter 21, The Setup. J.C. Harding wired. David had no idea all this intrigue was in progress. It was on Saturday, March the 29th, 2003, that J.C. showed up at David's house. Harding, according to Arlene Olson, had his marching orders from Gunderson, and his handler, Hilder, backed him up. This was the final visit by Bates and Harding. This was the 4th time that David encountered J.C. Harding. David was cordial and talkative. At the request of the FBI, in an attempt to obtain evidence against David, Harding wore the body wire. FBI agent Will Long was on the grass hiding near David's house where he would remain undetected. FBI agent Long fitted JC with the body wire. They designed the whole exercise to entrap David by baiting him into potentially making incriminating statements. After various attempts, JC interrupted the taping session by saying he needed to relieve himself. While in the bathroom, he whispered into his cell phone to Agent Long that he needed instructions to be more specific, but their attempts throughout the conversation failed miserably. FBI Agent Long had wasted over 3 hours laying on that cold, wet ground in hiding. JC tried his best to follow orders to entrap David. He was trying hard, but without looking too obvious, he repeatedly asked David during the recorded conversation if he wanted to blow kill federal officials. David said they were talking BS while David was preparing food at the kitchen island. He wasn't listening to much of what JC was saying. This was not a serious conversation. David was just being friendly to a departing acquaintance. When David caught JC's meaning, he instantly responded by saying that he does not want to hurt anyone. I'm going to sue them. Here is an excerpt of the body wire Harding said. So you're going to murder them? What are you going to do? What can you do? David, I'm going to sue them. Harding, right. This is not what Harding was fishing for. David, that's what I've been doing. That's the frustrating part is SIC. The only thing we got is the court system, which is so crooked. Harding, gotcha. So you think you can beat them at their own system? David, yep. Harding, I want to know something for sure. This is dead serious what I'm asking you this. SIC. You talked to me about this on a couple of occasions. Do you want to do it? Do you not want to do it? David, what? Harding, your problem with the 3 wise men. David, I'm just suing them. David also said, you know, I haven't offered anyone money to harm any. I have not offered anyone money to harm anyone. Harding said, right. During the trial, the government position was David cleverly detected that Harding was wired and wouldn't repeat the fictitious previous offers on the tape. So the government wanted to depict David as cunning, clever, and a nefarious man on the one hand, and a total idiot on the other. What sort of legally trained and astute idiot would make an offer to a nearly total stranger to kill 3 federal officers, including a judge? David wanted to use Babylon to fight Babylon. As presented as part of the detention hearing of April the 7th, 2003, his answer to Harding's question, so you think you can beat them? Is you going to answer?
Yep. Hello there. Hola. ¿Cómo está? ¿Cómo estás?
Hold on just one second. Okay, I'm going to continue reading here. The phone rang, sorry. David made it perfectly clear that he'll fight these government thugs in their own courts by using their own court system to fight them. Does this sound like the wild ravings of an imbecile? We believe that Harding and Agent Long later cooked up the story that David made $10,000 offer to JC. On the first occasion, they had met because the body wire caper flunked. When questioned under oath at David's trial, Bates and Harding couldn't get straight their stories of how he offered the $10,000. The jurors didn't buy their testimonies. JC didn't hold David to the scenario of hiring him as a hitman earlier when wired because it never happened. The alleged $10,000 kitchen counter offer to kill Judge Lodge, AUSA Cook, and IRS Agent Hines mentioned in the FBI 302 was never mentioned in the conversation recorded on the body wire. Isn't that strange? Based solely on hearsay conversations with unknown individuals, the government indicted David. They did no meaningful investigation of witnesses' credibility, reliability, or motivation. Government agents, without even a modicum of skepticism, simply took anyone's word as fact. The parade of government witnesses were liars, felons, and opportunists. Most defense witnesses were merely responsive to their recollections, with nothing to lose or gain. Why would the government place so much weight on J.C. Harding's testimony when so consistently under oath he perjured himself? By simply checking his phone and travel records, they could easily have verified his claims. He claimed that he had met with David some 50 times over a long course of time. He testified when questioned by AUSA Agent Michael P. Sullivan, Chief Prosecutor, Counterterrorism Unit of the U.S. Attorney's Office against David. We talked about my knowledge of guns and that I grew up around guns and shotguns. David, wanted to know how extensive my background was, the basics of how I got into it and why I was into it. Harding testified that he had worked as a bodyguard and that David knew him through a friend who was also a bodyguard. How do you know he knew you through another bodyguard? They were good friends. They were close friends. Who is that? Mark Glover. Him and David, I don't know how, are very close friends, and I know Mark through doing security work bodyguarding. Mark Glover, in his 40s, a tall, good-looking black male, teaches at California University and online college, and runs a limo service. He brags about being a driver for Anthony Hilder and Barbara Streisand. David had never before even heard of Glover. Hilder was the one who sent Glover to pick up David in his limo at the airport. Glover called David before the Granada Forum meeting in Los Angeles, December 2002, and advised him that the forum was paying for all of his expenses. He had arranged for a hotel and pick up David at the airport. Mark drove David to lunch and then to the Orange County Freedom Forum meeting. At the forum meeting, Hilder's compliments went way overboard. Sycophant, trying to make a good impression on David. Hilder went so far as to have Glover bring to David's room an exotic dancer. Bare her to her G-string, she performed her dance. There was no sexual encounter. David gave her $20 tip and then she left. He had no idea why these people were so engaging. David said, "I was getting the royal treatment." He has no memory of Harding from the Granada Forum or the dinner. However, Bates made contact with David at the forum, and David remembers her. Next day, David returned to Idaho. Sullivan then asking Harding, "Have you worked as a bodyguard?" "Yes." "Have you worked with Mr. Glover?" "Yes." Harding testified that he became very friendly with David and frequently stayed at his house in Grangeville on the weekends. Sullivan asked, "During those visits, did Hinkson repeatedly discuss killing Cook, Hines, and Lodge? On the occasion that you got back to Grangeville, would you see Mr. Hinkson?" "Yes." "Would you talk to him on the same subject matters of the 3 federal officers?" "Extensively." "Did he mention these things about killing federal officers more than once?" "Every time we spoke, yes." "How many times?" 50. One would think that the FBI would have wanted to check out JC's testimony for reliability, unless of course they participated in a fraud. Why would this all have happened? Were there any corroborating witnesses at Wateroz that ever saw or heard of Harding before the December 2002 Granada Forum meeting in LA? How clandestine can we get? No phone calls, no records, just Harding's statements. As we'll see later, even John Harding, JC's father, said on the witness stand under oath that his son is a liar. Although the times of the various events are somewhat confusing, the chronology displays a pattern without an indictment. On August 21st, 2001, the feds presented David's case before the grand jury. Then, Nancy Cook in April of 2002 went to the grand jury to try to indict David but failed. David sued Cook, Hines, and others for $50 million on April 16, 2002. He alleged that Cook and IRS agent Hines had violated a number of U.S. laws and committed grand jury tampering. He said Nancy Cook forged a fraudulent grand jury indictment. David claims that there was no legal way Nancy Cook could have gotten an indictment because the grand jury's term had ended and the members were scattered over a large area of Idaho. David suggests that we do an audit of their travel receipts, etc. If this is true, Nancy Cook committed a felony and others suborned her felony. The grand jury adjourned permanently in April, signing a no bill. After David sued Cook and Hines, Cook galvanized into action and supposedly brought together the same grand jury on July 17, 2002 for one final session, at which time she got her indictment. Dave remembers that attorney Mahaffey told him that Cook had offered to dismiss the criminal indictment if he would drop the civil suit against her and Hines. Later, Cook told attorney Mahaffey that before the raid, she did not have enough information to prosecute David, but after the raid on November the 21st, she did. Just a couple of weeks later, the Granada Forum episode began. The Gunderson-Hilder plan, using Annie Bates and J.C. Harding to entrap David, was set into action. But there was plenty of time to prepare Harding's testimony for David's trial and be sure he got it right. Does it help or hurt to get angry? Chapter 22. Let's try to mitigate our anger. On May the 21st, 2006, a couple of months after we hired attorney Dennis Reardon as David's appellate counsel, he filed a motion for a new trial. I sent a letter to David. Dear David, if I had to endure what you have undergone, I'm sure I couldn't have done as well as you have. Again, you amaze everyone with your focus. Relapses are normal. I'll let everyone know how upbeat you remain in spite of the foul, evil treatment you suffer on an hourly basis. But little by little, we reveal the truth, and we move closer to justice. No one can be part of the scam perpetrated by the wicked villains currently in control of this and many other governments, without forfeiting part of their humanity. For some, only God will punish. Those who are amoral know no honor. They only slither and strike when it's opportune. For you to endure until the ranks of the valiant begin to increase is your great challenge. On the radio, you have been likened to David and Goliath. With a slingshot, you slew the giant. But before we talk about developments, let me share with you this bit of this bit of observation on anger. Anger is an emotional state that varies in intensity from mild irritation to intense fury and rage. According to Charles Spielberger, Ph.D., a psychologist who specializes in the study of anger, like other emotions, it is accompanied by physiological and biological changes. When you get angry, your heart rate and blood pressure go up, as do the levels of your energy hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Anger can be caused by both external and internal events. You could be angry at a specific person, such as a coworker or supervisor, or event, a traffic jam, a canceled flight, or your anger could be caused by worrying or brooding about your personal problems. Memories of traumatic or enraging events can also trigger angry feelings. The instinctive, natural way to express anger is to respond aggressively. Anger is a natural, adaptive response to threats. It inspires powerful, often aggressive feelings and behaviors, which allow us to fight and to defend ourselves when we are attacked. A certain amount of anger, therefore, is necessary to our survival. On the other hand, we can't physically slash out at every person or object that irritates or annoys us. Laws, social norms, and common sense place limits on how far our anger can take us. People use a variety of both conscious and unconscious processes to deal with their angry feelings. The three main approaches are expressing, suppressing, and calming. Expressing your angry feelings is an assertive, not aggressive manner. It is the healthiest way to express anger. To do this, you have to learn how to make clear what your needs are and how to get them met without hurting others. Being assertive doesn't mean being pushy or demanding. It means being respectful of yourself and others. Anger can be suppressed and then converted or redirected. This happens when you hold in your anger, stop thinking about it, and focus on something positive. The aim is to inhibit or suppress your anger and convert it into a more constructive behavior. The danger in this type of response is that if it isn't allowed outward expression, your anger can turn inward on yourself. Anger turned inward may cause hypertension, high blood pressure, or depression. Unexpressed anger can create other problems. It can lead to pathological expressions of anger, such as passive-aggressive behavior. Getting back at people indirectly without telling them why, rather than confronting them head-on. Or a personality that seems perpetually cynical and hostile. People who are constantly putting others down, criticizing everything, and making cynical comments have not learned how to constructively express their anger. Not surprisingly, they aren't likely to have many successful relationships. Finally, you can calm down inside. This means not just controlling your outward behavior, but also controlling your internal responses. Steps to lower your heart rate, calm yourself down, and let the feelings subside. Turning to the IRS issue with fines and penalties based on lies, treachery, incompetence, and debauchery in the amount of $1,700,000, and for the income tax based on guesswork and floating straws in the amount of $2 million, it shows the precision and exactness of their fair voluntary tax code. My oh my, isn't this a system to honor and defend? In addition, you and many others know that not a red cent goes to services as being by the vast majority of Americans. It all goes to paying interest to the international banking cartel, every last cent. Don't worry, Dave. We'll take care of this. No guarantees, but I wouldn't put all my money on the IRS winning. Now, as I told you on the phone, I have people on the air and am reaching thousands of people. If they're so dumbed down by the media and politicians that they can't tell light from darkness is another issue. Also, there is a growing base of people who will share our concerns. You are a celebrity among many people. Act the part, David. Don't let the guards or others think of you as anything other than a righteous victim of an unjust conspiracy. As you know, Swisher is in the sewer. We are piling on more and more, no heaping more truth on him than he can bear. More organizations are throwing him out. We are involved with a congressional movement of which he's becoming a star. Also, his buddy, Walt Lindsey, the former regional commandant for the Western Division of the Marine Corps League, is now in jail. We're investigating him now, and he may have committed felonies too. Apparently, he is also a fraud like Swisher. I'll keep you posted as we expose the criminals one by one. This takes time, but we are relentless and growing stronger. Do as I say, Dave. Remember, Mom and I love you deeply and are so proud of you. I know you won't let us down by letting this captured overthrow socialist government destroy you. Our prayers, along with now thousands of others, are constant. Uncle Kenny, Aunt Betty, Douglas, McLam, Wes, Lou, and so many others remember you in their prayers every single day. I'll be going on radio Thursday afternoon. The topic is stolen valor and pinning the tail on the jackass Swisher. Love, Mom and Dad. Exposure may be our only weapon to right a wrong. The haunting question is, are there enough people concerned who will help? Chapter 23, Memorandum to the National Marine Corps League. Once Joel Volk, the legitimate combat Marine, learned of Swisher's fraud in June 2005, he was incensed. The evidence about Swisher was overwhelming. Volk confirmed the hoax and went after Swisher unrelentingly. In response, Swisher waged an offensive campaign against Joe Volk and others who were awakening. Swisher, as the Sergeant Lanahan League commandant, managed to throw Volk and a couple of others out of the local detachment because they challenged his credentials. An appeal went to national headquarters in Washington, D.C. I worked with Joel Volk participating in Swisher's exposure. I sent a memorandum in 2006 to the National Judge Advocate Vic Voltaggio of the Marine Corps League about PFC Elvin Joe Swisher. 1. Facts. In 1954, Elvin Joe Swisher joined the United States Marine Corps and was discharged in 1957. His tour of foreign service occurred at Camp Fuji, Japan, from March the 4th, 1955 till May the 6th, 1956. During his service, he rose to the rank of corporal. However, due to disciplinary action, he was demoted to PFC, Private First Class. In the 1980s, Mr. Swisher was charged with raping over a prolonged period of time his 3 daughters. He was not acquitted of the charges, but the local district attorney, Dennis Albers, during the trial spoke with one of the jurors. Albers was sanctioned by the Idaho Supreme Court and barred from ever seeking public office as a district attorney again. No charges were ever again filed against Swisher. After the death of his father, a decorated combat veteran, Joe Swisher began for the first time wearing medals of honor and seeking recognition as a war hero. His former wife of some 20 years, mother of the girls for which he had been charged with rape, stated to a former assistant prosecuting attorney, Wesley Hoyt, that she had never seen or heard in their entire marriage anything about a decoration he had earned or received. Recently, a friend of former combat Marine Joseph Volk told him that he saw Swisher parading around in a uniform and decorations as recent as October 2005. Swisher testified under oath at various hearings and or trials that in 1953 he was disabled by a hand grenade at the end of the Korean War. Later he revised his testimony, stating that he received the injuries not at the end of the Korean War, but as a member of a secret special forces, a classified mission, whose job it was to free prisoner of war, POWs. Upon cross-examination, he was asked how he could have been selected as a participant in this special forces mission at age 15 or 16. He would have had to have joined the Corps at age 13. He changed his testimony, admitting his true term of service. But then he said he had received multiple gunshot wounds in September 1955 in Korea. His ears, he said, were blown out in military action. However, his DD-214 showed no VA claim when he was discharged on February 10, 1957. In a grand jury hearing April 16, 2002, he testified that he was merely 4 hours away from getting a doctorate, PhD, in a special education at the University of Idaho. Also, he testified he received a BA from Central Missouri University and a master's from the University of Missouri. At another grand jury hearing a couple of years later, February 10, 2004, he now stated he was 6 hours away from his PhD dissertation. Mr. Swisher testified that he had worked for his father's company, Idaho Mining and Development in Cottonwood, Idaho. Throughout all his various testimonies under oath, he said he had charged Waterized Supplement Company, a local manufacturing company owned by David Hinkson, for his services. He stated that there were several employees, varying up to 5, that worked for a company called Northwest Analytical. He denied at a grand jury hearing that he owned the company, said it was owned for the past 3 or 4 years by a man by the name of Doug Sellers. There has been no evidence or even an indication that Mr. Sellers owns the company. In a GJ hearing, Attorney Nolan asked, "You brought a friend of yours, Doug Sellers?" Swisher answered, "Probably." The person who he had been attributing ownership to was probably merely a friend or associate. In mid-2000, Swisher claims that Joel Volk introduced him to Waterized. He mused that he had a friend by the name Arthur Arthritis who went everywhere with him. The WOZ Waterized products, he said, were effective. He testified that his pain diminished after WOZ treatment by 60 to 70%. He was enthusiastic about the effect the products had on him. He said that David Hinkson invited him for a tour of the plant, but that it was Jerry Gray, WOZ plant manager, who asked him to work for WAS and to run assaying tests for the company to assure full compliance with FDA regs. In July of 2000, Swisher claimed he met David Hinkson for the first time, and until April of 2002, he had spoken to David about a dozen times. He said he initially did testing a couple of times a month to almost daily. He claims to have been paid about $50,000 in 2002 for his tests for which he charged $10 each and at max did 3 to 4 per week. But he testified that David owed him $50,000 for the work he claimed to have done. Prior to this initial introduction to Swisher, Annette Hasselone involved David in a lawsuit. This woman was being sought by the California police on felony charges. This Hasselone claimed David promised her half of Wateraw's business for working as a sales rep. She had an 8th grade education, now calls herself Dr. Hasselone, and she sued David for some $800,000. The jurors concluded that she should get $95,000. David's father and mother loaned him, at the insistence of Britt Groom, David's lawyer, $157,000 to cover the trial expenses. July the 5th, 2000 was the first time David's parent, Roland and Faye Hinkson, met Britt Groom. Another employee, Goose, stole fencing materials from David, was fired, and then filed a whistleblowing complaint with the IRS for apparent underpayment of income taxes. The reward sought was $74,000. In February of 2000, IRS agent Vernon, alias Morgan, filed a civil lawsuit against David on behalf of the IRS. David in return sued him, other agents, and the U.S. government individually for $50 million. Thereupon, Vernon turned the case over to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Subsequently, the government agents called for a grand jury. It found no evidence sustaining charges against David, but certain agents of the IRS and Justice Department were adamant and relentless in pursuit of David. They continued calling grand juries until they got one that would indict. So they got a false indictment without a grand jury. This was the situation when Swisher became involved. On July the 6th, 2000, David brought his family to his parents' home in Ouray, Colorado. He towed his new boat behind his motorhome. He met with Mr. Lane Mills, publisher of the Freedom Bee newspaper in Montrose, Colorado, to discuss David's purchasing for sale newspaper in Idaho. David said his intent was to expose government corruption. Swisher started his assaying procedures during this time, as evidenced by a certificate of assay dated August 13, 2000. On January 7, 2001, about 2:30 p.m., Roland met Joe Swisher and his wife, Barbara, for the first time at Gilanda's restaurant at Grangeville. David, along with his wife, Marie, and a friend, Rod Remelin, invited them all to dinner to meet Roland. Later that day, Swisher and Roland had an amiable visit with David and in his Wateraw's office. On April the 3rd, 2001, Britt Groom and his family came to Ouray as the guest of Roland and Faye Hinkson. 10 days later, David flew to Moscow, Russia on a business venture. Then Joe Swisher with Barbara came to Ouray as guest of Roland and Faye. Swisher had volunteered to assist an investigation of a fraud occurring in Ouray. Since he claimed to be a friend of David's, and since Roland offered to pay for his gasoline costs to come help, he would put them up in one of their new townhouses. Swisher was on his way to New Mexico on a business trip. The following month, David told Roland that Jerry Gray had given Swisher $2,500 for expenses to stop in Ouray as was agreed. Roland was furious. He called Britt Groom on July the 19th, 2001, telling him that Swisher is a liar and a thief, and that he is totally dishonest and deceptive. It was after these incidents and communications that Swisher claimed that David trusted him totally, and because of that trustworthiness, wanted him to kill the people David was suing. Joe Swisher testified under oath that he had killed many people, too many. He said that such conversations with David occurred throughout the year 2001. Also, Swisher testified in the 2001 GJ hearing that he had been paid in full and had no problems with David from 2000 to 2002. In March of 2002, Swisher said he increased testing because they want to be very sure that they have a constant quality control. He testified that everything tested has been correct on the label, and that David has superior products. But David swears that Swisher did the test wrong after IRS Special Agent Stephen Hines went to his home and talked with Swisher. In Swisher's GJ testimony, April of 2002, he couldn't remember if David made any threats against government agents. Yet a SWAT team surrounded David's house, cuffed him, and took him to Coeur d'Alene before Judge Williams. The judge released David on his own recognizance. Swisher testified that the last time he had contact with David was April 6, 2002. Mr. Swisher testified on February 10, 2004 that after that after the time David was arrested from November 2002 to January 2003, that David considered him his best friend. During this period of time, David and several of his employees claimed that Swisher put cyanide in the potassium in an effort to sabotage the products. Employees stated that cyanide is odorless, but Swisher sniffed a sample of the contaminated product and declared it was cyanide. In fact, David dumped out 1,500 gallons of the product. In order for a mistake to have been made, one would have to put in gallons of cyanide. Swisher offered to provide bromine for water eyes to cover up traces of the cyanide. Also, other strange things began happening when Swisher gained access to the factory. Yet everything stopped once he was barred from the premises. November is when Swisher's blackmailing began. It wasn't until January the 4th that David announced to everyone at the factory that Swisher was blackmailing him. Swisher was demanding 50% of Water Oz, wanted to be half partner, or else he promised to tell about the cyanide in the product. No cyanide is ever used at Water Oz, but it is used in mining operations and as assaying tests, such as Swisher conducts. Swisher let the word out in September 2003 that if paid his fee, he would testify for David in his favor in a related pending tax case. Proceeding before the grand jury on February 10, 2004, Assistant United States Attorney Tom Bradley asked Swisher if there were any discussions with David about threats. Swisher said that on one occasion prior to January 2003, David said to him, "You are one of my best friends, if not my best friend." He said, "I want you to have the complex, the recreational office building worth over $1 million, because I am never going to do anything with it." He said, "You will have to finish it, but it's yours." I said, "Yeah, that's nice of you, David." And then it was about maybe 2 weeks later that he approached me again. He said, "Look, you know I trust you and I depend on you," and so on and so forth. And he said, "I have given you all this property every day." And he said, "I will give you $10,000 a head if you will kill the following people for me." And he said, "Everything will be taken care of." The complex referred to was a portion of the David's 104 acres site with an attractive home and an $850,000 three-story building located in Grangeville, Idaho. Swisher had thus claimed a recreation center and 40 acres. He went on to testify that David wanted me to try to make the concentrates for him. And all this took place while Mr. Hinkson was out, while he was at home. He was not in jail at that time. I have a diary with a notation that David, as of March 19, 2002, would not even take a call from Swisher. After April of 2002, Swisher claimed that David not only promised you, but in fact gave him 10 acres behind the Water Oz factory building. There is a canyon behind the factory owned by others, and there is only 1 acre before crossing the canyon. Later, January 14, 2005, under oath, when cross-examined about the now 20 acres he claimed David had given him and a patrol road grader, he said, "David broke off contact with me in January of 2003. David has never owned a Huber road grader, but did own a Hustler road grader." The next question asked was, when he, David, gave you the 20 acres and road grader, it didn't have anything to do with soliciting anybody, did it? Answer, no. When asked if his prior testimony, April 2002, was true, when he testified favorably for David, he said, "It was true as I believed it to be at that time." He said that the first time David had approached him on the subject of threats was right after he lost the jury trial and the jury had awarded monies to the lady, Annette Hasselon. In his sworn testimony under oath on January 14, 2005, he said it was after April 2002 that was the first time Swisher claimed David offered him money to kill people. As evidenced on David's passport and other documents and affidavits, David was not in Idaho or even the United States for most of the time from June to November the 3rd, 2002. In June, he was in Russia. On July the 2nd, he brought his family and 2 Russian girls to visit Roland and Faye in Ouray, Colorado. On July the 4th, he took the Russian girls and family to Las Vegas. In July, he went to Venezuela and then to New York. He was gone from Idaho for about 5 months in 2002. However, he invited a friend, Roman Ponomarenko, to come to the U.S. to tour his factory on October the 10th, 2002. Then on October the 19th, 2002, David flew to Ukraine, meeting with Roman to discuss purchase of a factory there. Also on October the 12th, David was introduced in Ukraine to his future wife, Tetiana. He wrote a check as an earnest money deposit for an abandoned water factory. But shortly thereafter, upon returning to the United States, he was arrested and ultimately convicted solely on the testimony of Elvin Joseph Swisher's copious fabrications. Throughout November, David was in contact with Mr. Ponomarenko, who signed an affidavit saying that Swisher had been blackmailing David for some time. During the time, David would have nothing nothing do with Swisher and refusing to accept any calls. Jerry Gray, who was still the general manager, insisted that Swisher be kept on to test products. Her stated reason was that he needed him to testify on FDA issues, as he had done in the grand jury hearing of April 16, 2002. Britt Groom in 2001 introduced Richard Bellin to David. Bellin was a paralegal of whom David had accepted as a phenomenal legal expert. Bellin claimed he had a Harvard law professor who would be helping him. He supposedly had written 3 books on IRS fraud, and according to David's testimony to Roland, he was the most knowledgeable legal mind in America. Of course, later all concerned parties, including nearly all employees, came to recognize that he was a charlatan, had plagiarized the books he claimed to have written, was an ex-convict, and a big disappointment to David and his father, mother, and wife. To a limited extent, Groom participated in an attempt to have David overturn turn over half of his company to Bellin. He had endeavored to get David to do whatever he asked. While in jail in Boise, Idaho, Groom and Bellin tried to get David to acknowledge a fraudulent contract. Bellin insisted Swisher be allowed to get access to the factory. David announced over the loudspeaker at WAS that Swisher was blackmailing him or would testify that David wanted to hire him to kill the agents, etc. Thereafter, no one except for Jerry would even speak to Swisher. But at David's trial, Swisher testified that in September or October of 2003, David called me and said that he had a partnership with Rich Bellin, that he had talked to Mr. Bellin, and they wanted to hire me as a consultant to go out to Water Oz and look the facility over, make things safer for employees, and make things safer in the product for the general public. And in my discussion with David, I said, "Are you sure that Mr. Bellin is your partner?" And he said, "Absolutely." Roland Hinkson, following the wishes of David, who had wanted Bellin and Swisher off the property, sent an official notice of termination to Bellin. Bellin was fired from Water Oz in November. This is incorrect. Bellin was not fired from Water Oz. He never worked for Water Oz. His job was to perform legal services for David's defense. The following month, December the 4th, Bellin, Swisher, and others descended on the factory armed with a TRO, temporary restraining order, from a local judge, who later apologized for his indiscretion. He reversed his order prior to trial, which was later sustained. The culprits, Bellin, Swisher, and others, had lost and were barred from entering the Water Oz facilities, but at tremendous cost to David. David swore that during his sentencing hearing, Swisher gave me this affidavit saying he had never gone to the Water Oz factory. He knew he had to say that he came in July because this affidavit swears that he never came out to the factory at all between August and in between August and November. Because if he had come out to the factory, it would prove he is the one that made the testing wrong, and this affidavit proves it, and he was trying to get a lot of money. Additionally, Swisher testified he has top secret documents to prove he was a genuine war hero. The fact proves that Swisher had open heart surgery immediately before the alleged time that David was supposed to have been such a close confidant and trusting a man who was incontinent, in a wheelchair, unable to perform lab functions, who he said he spoke a dozen times to David before the first grand jury. He claims to have been awarded the Marine Commendation Medal before Congress created it. He claims he was awarded the Purple Heart, even though the only injuries he sustained were an automobile accident in the state of Washington. The National Personnel Records Center verified that he is a fraud. Their thorough investigation revealed that Mr. Swisher forged and falsified his records and involved various government agencies in an attempt to legitimize his fraud. Swisher defrauded the Veterans Administration by doctoring documents, making claims for monies that he was not entitled to receive, and medical benefits reserved for members of the armed forces who suffered injuries while in defense of their nation. There is no record of his having been involved in any classified operations. His claim to having been awarded a second DD-214 was recorded after David was jailed. Only a DD-215 can substitute a DD-214. After Swisher's fraud was exposed, he was promoted by superior officials to the Regional Board of the Marine Corps League. Thereafter, he ran for the position of judge advocate but lost. The Federal Court, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, January 4, 2005, under the auspices of Judge Richard C. Talman, advised the defense that it would take considerable time to check Swisher's documents and it would confuse the jury. He admitted that the government's case rested on Swisher being a combat veteran. Regardless, he denied the defense from introducing Swisher's fraud to the jurors. He said Swisher's lies under oath didn't render the trial unfair. The government didn't dispute Swisher's fraud of the VA, and they deliberately failed to correct false impressions about Swisher. Former Marine Joseph Volk, who was once a friend of Swisher's, had personally delivered a year ago to the VA hospital in Spokane, Washington, the same document showing Swisher's fraud. Then again, he had delivered the same information, yet no action has been taken. Instead, the government informed the jury that Swisher was a combat veteran who fought in the Korea and had learned there how to kill. The court denied the defendant's motion for a mistrial after the defense learned that the government knew of and had hidden from the defense the evidence of fraud. Judge Talman concluded that Swisher's powerful testimony about killing was impressive. Besides, he said the documents were merely rank hearsay. Even though the defense asked for and the defendant Hinkson insisted on a mistrial due to falsified documents, a mistrial was denied. In determining how to handle the request for mistrial, Judge Talman ordered the jurors out of the courtroom. Therefore, from the evidence, it appears the government was as guilty as Mr. Swisher. 2. Question. In addition to the evidence gathered by the Marine Corps League and the Purple Heart Organization for fraudulent claims, was Elvin Joseph Swisher involved in any other misdeeds or treachery? Discussion. 1. Obviously, if the testimony and facts presented above are accurate and truthful, there is no question that Mr. Swisher has committed numerous felonies. Falsely testifying under oath is destructive to any judicial determination. 2. To defraud the government of the state of Idaho and United States carries serious consequences. To parade as a war hero, stealing the honor and credibility of those who have legitimately served their nation is despicable. 3. To take money and services under false pretenses is criminal. 4. However, to lie for financial gain with evil intent only to destroy another fellow human being is indefensible and unpardonable. 3. Conclusion. Although Elvin Joseph Swisher is an elderly man, the grief, heartache, the loss of years with the threat of a lifetime of solitary confinement for his victim does not engender pity for such a person. From his past behavior, it appears that there is no rehabilitation that can make society safe from him. He continues to parade as an honorable man and has become somewhat as a master of deception. This man is either a sociopath or just plain evil. Certainly, to have him parading as the product of the Marine Corps and for it to be condoned is shameful. On December the 1st, 2005, Joe Volk called me to let me know that there will be a National Board of Inquiry held on the Swisher case. After all the calls made and disappointments we suffered, finally, they will do something. Faye and I knew that David's entire case hinged on overcoming the lying testimony of just one person, Elvin Joe Swisher. We knew that on appeal we would likely get about 20 minutes to argue our case. All of the violations of David's rights under the Constitution, we had to choose the most egregious to argue. David's life was worth only 20 minutes or so to the appellate court's time. However, we did observe that at least one judge and probably two at the appellate court level were rational, thorough, and honorable. No shoddy or cursory glossing over the facts in an attempt to sustain the ruling of trial court Judge Talman. A lot of people were outraged, but was there in fact justice? Chapter 24, Daughter describes Swisher as a sociopath. On December the 7th, 2008, I received a letter from Joe Swisher's daughter, Cheryl. She had seen my article on my website. Mr. Hinkson, thank you for your insightful article regarding the numerous criminal activities of Joe Swisher as one of the daughters molested and abused by him, and in fact his only daughter by blood. I applaud you. It is unthinkable that he may be allowed to escape justice yet again, and let me assure you that he is held in the worst regard by his immediate family, with the exception of his current wife, with whom I attended high school. It is my belief, and the belief of mental health professionals with which I have had contact, that Joseph Swisher is a sociopath, in modern terms, antisocial personality, which would support your assertions that he takes no responsibility for his wrongdoings and in fact always blames others if and when he is accused. I fervently hope his sentencing includes the maximums allowable by law, although even this would fail to provide justice for his lifetime of unrelenting criminal activity and numerous wrongs to individuals and society. He is a blight upon this earth. I'm very sorry about your son, Cheryl. I responded, Dear Cheryl, thank you so much for your honor and strength as displayed in your letter. I would like to share your letter with others, but I certainly can understand any reluctance. Your statement could help add credibility to all the evidence we've worked to acquire. I have enough material to write an entire book about Joe. The government still wants to reward Joe if possible. Okay, I've made it down to the bottom of page 150, and that was my goal. We'll try to get 50 pages done at a time. The next audio will pick up with page 151. Again, it's a 300 and something page book, so we're about halfway done. Thank you for your time.